Hi there. In this video, we're going to go over understanding and integrating your shadow. My name is Christopher, and my coaching business is Humble Fox Consultations. And with that, let's get right into it. So I pulled from a couple of different sources, mainly Carl Jung's autobiography, Memory, Dreams, and Reflections, Murray Stein's Jung's Map of the Soul, and then Robert Bly wrote a book called A Little Book on the Human Shadow, which is a great short little read, which I recommend checking out if you want to dive further into this. This is a structure of the overall psyche according to Jung. I actually made a video on this if you want to go more in depth. And today we're going to be talking about the human shadow, which has roots into the collective unconscious, the personal unconscious, and then the conscious mind as well. So we're going to be diving into what the shadow is today. And before we get into that, I want to just take a moment to honor and respect the shadow, because we're entering into sacred ground here when talking about the shadow. And the shadow itself is very elusive and very real. And so I just want to acknowledge that as we go into speaking about something using very structured and oriented language, because the shadow is a lot more fluid and more illusory than what our words can allude to. So I want to honor and respect the shadow first. Now, with that, what is the shadow? So according to Jung, the shadow is a moral problem. And what he meant by this is that sort of we have these drives and these instincts inside of us that are just natural to being a human or being an animal, yet we also have these conditions that are placed on us by our caretakers, by society, by our friend groups, by our peers, by different organizations that we're a part of. And so there's a conflict within the human psyche that occurs where we have these aspects of ourselves, but we don't want to show the world. And that sometimes we don't even want to show ourselves that we have these aspects. And so that's why it's kind of considered a moral problem. And Carl Jung writes, "For no one can become conscious of the shadow without moral effort." So within the shadow, there are essentially two levels to it. There is the personal shadow, which is mainly what we're going to be talking about today. And then there's also the collective shadow as well. And so what I mean about the collective shadows, we could talk about the shadow of humanity in general, but we can even go a little bit more specific and talk about the shadow of a nation. For instance, Nazi Germany's shadow of the Holocaust during World War II, or we have in the United States, the genocide of the Native American and First Nations people, and the incarceration rates of certain specific types of minority groups in the United States. That's a modern shadow that the United States currently has. And so we have these collective shadows of how these different structures want to present themselves to the world, and then how they actually are operating behind closed doors as well. And so today we're mainly going to be talking about the personal shadow, but this can extend to the collective shadow as well. So in regards to how the shadow is created, it's really important to understand this so we can get a good understanding of the shadow in general and what we're doing and what we're up to. So this is a picture of Robert Bly down here. And in his book, he basically talked about as children, we're 360-degree balls of energy. We're just balls of light. We're able to express ourselves at any given moment. If we want to cry, we cry. If we laugh, we laugh. If we want to poop our pants, we poop our pants. We're doing all of these things without our control and inhibition, and it's just happening. And over time, we become a little bit more acculturated, and through the process of engagement with our caretakers, we learned pretty quickly that certain behaviors were accepted and certain behaviors weren't. Me screaming at the top pitch of my vocal expression in a crowded area was not something that my parents generally liked. And so there were certain behaviors inside of me that my caretakers then had wanted me not to exhibit. And this happens to all of us. And ultimately, we learn that there are parts of ourselves that are maybe unlovable. And as children, our number one objective for survival is to be loved and accepted by our caretakers and those around us. We needed that for survival needs. So we are willing to siphon off, cut off certain parts of ourselves that aren't quote unquote redeemable to our family structure or to the societal structure as a whole. So we become who others need us to be in order to be loved. Some examples of this you may have heard of as a child are, "Can't you be still? Stop crying. Good children don't get angry. Be a nice girl or nice boy." I think all of us want to be nice girls or nice boys, right? But there's something very toxic in that we don't get to express who we actually are. And what ends up happening is that we create what is known as a persona, or the outer mask. And this is sort of going to be an understanding of how these three structures of the psyche relate to each other: the shadow, the ego, and the persona. So the persona is the outer mask that is created as the face that we present to the world. This would be the nice boy or the nice girl, the always smiling, always happy, showing this persona, which is also known as the false self, to the world, because the shadow is who we potentially really are on the inside, and the integration is to allow as much as who we really are into the world. And so the way that these relate to each other, according to Stein, is that the persona and shadow are more or less exact opposites of one another, and yet they are closest twins. The shadow is all of the rejected aspects of the persona, and this is what the ego does. Is the ego is a tool facilitating the energetic exchanges through these. The shadow is still going to enact itself. It's just going to do so in unconscious ways. Just because those desires and drives have been hidden from us doesn't mean that they aren't still going to get met in some way. This could be a greedy part trying to find its way to make money, while the persona has this conflict of not wanting to appear greedy to others on the outside. So there's that moral dilemma that sort of gets involved in the shadow and persona complex there. The shadow is inner desire driven, what we truly desire, and then the persona is what the world wants from us, or what the culture wants from us. And so we have within us natural human emotion. We have hatred, fear, anger, greed, jealousy, sexuality, selfishness. These are typically what end up in our shadow. Now, this can vary on culture. This can vary on who our caretakers need us to be. This can vary on how we were raised. Because in some instances, for instance, like gang culture, hatred might actually be something that is promoted in the personality. And so therefore, we have our love get siphoned off into the shadow. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that in a second. But basically understand that these are the common emotions, along with some others as well, and aspects of our personality that end up getting put into the shadow. And the thing about this is that just because they're in the shadow, these do not go away. We still have hatred. We still have fear, anger, greed, jealousy, sexuality, selfishness. We still have all those parts of ourselves, and typically we don't want to show those to the world. And that can be seen in basic human interaction. All of us, for instance, have a persona that when we're asked by a stranger, "How are you doing?" we don't say, "I'm feeling a lot of anger right now." We typically say, "Oh, I'm doing good. How are you doing?" "Oh, I'm good." And we just kind of stay at the surface level reality. And that is sort of the false personality and the interaction that's going on at that level. But we have these quote unquote shadow qualities, these desires, these emotions that are lurking behind us that we may not be conscious of, but our work in integrating the shadow becomes becoming conscious of what's going on behind our awareness. I love this quote by Robert Bly. I think this is very important to put in here. "If a man loves God, he can become holy in 20 years. But if he hates God, he can do the same in 2 years." Our ability to hate may be in our shadow. And why this is so important is that if we're unable to recognize that we have hatred, that hatred is still there inside of us at some deep level, and it will come out in ways that are unconscious and unhealthy unless we learn how to integrate hatred into our lives in a healthy way. And that's what I want to talk about here. And it's a very delicate process because these are very deep and archaic emotional patterns that exist inside of us. And if we don't learn how to integrate them, then once again, they still enact themselves. We just aren't conscious of it. So in regards to the golden shadow or the white shadow, this is a concept that you may have heard of before. And this is what I was talking about when I was talking about gang culture. So we don't only repress evil aspects of our shadow, and that there is a misconception when doing shadow work that we're only integrating quote unquote bad parts of ourselves. Actually, inside of our shadow is a lot of really healthy and genuine characteristics that were shunned or shamed from us as children. If we were showing our light to our parents or teachers or caretakers or other children, there's a good chance that we were shamed for who we were. And so we hid that part of ourselves and didn't want anything to do with it. So in regards to gang culture, if a gang member is taught to hate, to be angry all the time, to show violence in his persona, in his shadow is going to be his love for humanity, his compassion for others, his love for himself, right? And I use that as an extreme example, but that happens to all of us. Some fundamental aspects that typically end up in our human shadows, even if we are in a gang culture, even if we're raised in a quote unquote classic family, which by the way, there is no such thing as a classic family, but our power, our inner power, our love for ourselves and for humanity, our compassion, our self-worth. If we feel that we are unworthy on the surface, that means that our sense of worthiness is on the inside of who we are. So the bright qualities that you admire in others represent the disowned aspects of your unique potential. So how we can start seeing the shadow is by looking at other people, and the people that we idealize. If you can think of anyone you idealize, whether it be celebrities or therapists or people in your life who you look up to, they may have qualities about them that you idealize, but in reality, they are just a reflection. They are a mirror for what is really happening inside of you. And so a great way to start doing some shadow work is to start writing down or start seeing in your day-to-day life, who do you idealize, and can you start owning those parts of yourself and to take them off the pedestal and to own those parts and to see their humanity as well, but to see that these parts, that inner power, that inner confidence, that compassion, that self-worth, whatever it is, exists inside of you. So here's some steps to integrating the shadow. So first and foremost, it's very important that you ask the shadow for help, that we talk to it. The shadow is an autonomous complex, meaning it has its own it's autonomous. It has its own way of relating to the world. It has a mind of its own, and it wants to be integrated. And so we can talk to and ask the shadow for help. And in this process, what typically happens is that there is a lot of guilt and shame for abandoning these certain parts of ourselves. And so we have to ask for forgiveness for these parts that have been rejected, that we may have not have had access to for our entire lives. And then we have to forgive ourselves as well. And that's a huge part of this shadow work. So how can we start spotting the shadow? Well, when you're out in your day-to-day world, I mentioned the idealizing, but another great way to work with the shadow and to see the shadow in your day-to-day is whenever you can notice yourself judging somebody for something. What you can do in those moments is, instead of judging them for what their behavior is or how they're acting, or for even who they are, you can take that moment and you can look down at the judgment and see, oh, that I have that is inside of me, and I'm judging myself for that, and then projecting that judgment onto another individual. A very common phrase in 12-step recovery is, if you spot it, you got it. If you see something in someone else, you can look down and say, oh man, I've got that exact same quality inside of myself. And the process then becomes, how do we love and accept? And so a good practice for this actually comes from, I heard this from Ram Dass, is that every time you judge something or someone, can you try appreciating that? Can you try appreciating that quality in themselves, but in them, but also in yourself? Can you appreciate that quality in who you are? And that's where the work begins. That's where we can start learning to love ourselves. To start working with the shadow, dream work. Start keeping track of your dreams. And if you don't dream, that's okay, because if you have the intention to start working with your shadow, dreams will start coming to you. And also, if you want to dream as well, becoming sober is a great way to start accessing those deeper levels of REM sleep that will allow for those dreams to come. So starting to track your dreams, starting to work with dreams, that's a good way to start getting in touch with the shadow, with the unconscious or repressed parts of ourselves. Robert Bly talks about this concept of like eating the shadow. We have to eat the shadow, but we do so in a gradual way. It's not necessarily healthy to just be going around and just screaming and opening ourselves up to archaic and really intense energies. The shadow serves a purpose. There's a reason in society that we have our persona. And it's because if we were to just be constantly expressing ourselves all the time like little infants, we probably wouldn't get a whole lot done. So the integration process isn't necessarily to be able to express these deep and archaic emotions all the time. It's to be able to strengthen the ego, to tolerate the emotional processes that are coming up, and learning how to react in a way that's actually going to be beneficial to yourself and to others as well. So we gradually eat the shadow in a way that does not overwhelm the ego, that does not break the ego, cause psychosis, go into these very dark states. We allow it to come very gradually and slowly over time. Another great way to integrate the shadow is to work with a specialist, to go on retreats that focus on shadow work. Working with a specialist, they'll be able to point out different areas as well. And if you're comfortable with it, you can actually ask your friends to help point something out. One of the phrases that's very common is, you can see the speck in somebody else, but there's a giant log in your own eye. And other people can typically point out where your shadow is because they can see it. That's the whole thing about it, is we can't see it. It's an unconscious process that's happening inside of ourselves. So if you feel comfortable, maybe in a process group, in a men's or women's group, or perhaps even just with a comfortable group of friends, if you would do some shadow work with them by getting real and opening up about perhaps just some characteristics about who we are that maybe we're not so proud of, and we can ask them to reflect some of their ideas about that as well. And then the thing about the shadow is we have to own it. We have to own all of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We have to recognize that everything that we see in the external world exists inside of us, because we can only see the external world through who we are and through our body and imagination and senses, and that all exists inside of who we are. So we have to own it all. If you see something in the external world, we have to recognize that that exists inside of us. That doesn't mean what's happening in the external world is okay. It means that we have to own and empathize with what is occurring. And that is ultimately shadow work, and it's a lot easier said than done. So integrating the shadow, this is No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz, who created the Internal Family Systems, or the IFS framework. I think this is really important to understand when doing shadow work, is that there are no bad parts, that everything in the human psyche serves a purpose. And if you get to these deep, archaic human emotions, such as greed, such as the ability to conduct violence, such as the ability to hurt other people, start seeking understanding as to, maybe from a survival perspective, why these parts were necessary. That doesn't mean we enact those parts today. It means we can have dialogue and work with those parts and find a way to incorporate them into who we are today to serve the highest good. So we do not want to get rid of anything. We do not want to create more splits in our psyche. We want to integrate who we were. And so a lot of this happened in childhood, really early on, at ages 0 to 10, pretty much. And so we have to go back into our early childhood and start experiencing different aspects of who we were then. What lit us up? What were some areas of maybe some early developmental traumas that occurred? What was accepted in our family and what wasn't accepted in our family? Every aspect of our humanity is worthy of love. A good way to measure your shadow work is in different situations. So when you walk into a new room, do you change who you are? Do you compartmentalize who you are at work and at home? And we all do this to some extent, so there's no shame in that, but how much are we doing that with different friend groups, with our bosses, with different people? Do we constantly change and shift and manipulate who we are to become who others need us to be in that moment? Or can we be who we really are around our parents, our friends, our work, our therapists, our romantic partners? And that's the work. A great idea from Robert Bly is, what we repress, we regress. So the ideas of selfishness, anger, and boundary setting. So if we repress something, for instance, our selfishness, what ends up happening is not only in our childhood did that part get stunted at that developmental growth stage, let's say this happened at 5 years old, but if we're not using that part, it ends up regressing. So not only does it get stuck at 5 years old, but then it regresses or becomes an even more immature form of the energy pattern of what it was. So for instance, with selfishness, if we have to reincorporate selfishness into our life, we have to learn how to do that. And that takes time. We're going to end up making mistakes. And with selfishness, it may mean that we swing all the way to the other side of the spectrum of selfishness and then swing back and then kind of learn how to balance that. Same with the idea of anger and boundary setting. When we start reincorporating boundary setting in our life, if we haven't done that since early childhood and it regressed, we may be setting extremely hard boundaries all the time and not learning the delicate art and the dance of boundary setting. That's exactly what's happened to me in my work, is learning how to set boundaries again. I at first was setting really hard boundaries and sort of creating a little bit more harm than I was doing good, but I was learning how to use that muscle and then learning the art of boundary setting and how to do that in a more delicate way, which is something that I'm still learning how to do today. And same thing with my selfishness, learning how to be selfish in a healthy way that isn't completely 100% narcissistic, but that allows me to get my needs met in a healthy way. Measuring shadow work. Once again, I just want to read this to you and let this soak in. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to feel hatred, despair, jealousy. These are all natural human emotions. Learning to be kind and gentle with ourselves is key. This is not a free pass to behave in any way that you would like. We tend to hurt others when we are not conscious of these parts. So integrating these parts does not mean that we are acting these parts out. It means that we become conscious of them so that we aren't enacting unconscious dramas that may hurt other people. The paradox is that it is through integrating our anger that we become more peaceful, integrating our selfishness that we may become more compassionate, and integrating our hate that we may become more loving. I want to finish with this beautiful quote by Marian Williamson. The quote is actually longer than this, but just for the sake of our attention spans, I wanted to keep it right here. And this is such a beautiful quote about our shadow, which is that our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. That is from her book, A Return to Love. And what a beautiful quote about the human shadow, that in our shadow lies our deepest light. And that is ultimately what we're afraid of, and not these maybe shy little archaic primal energies compared to that light. So if you want to do some shadow work, you can click the link below and you and I can work one-on-one. We also could work in a group. I run men's and co-ed groups as well. So if you want, click the link below and schedule a free call and we'll get you situated exactly where you need to be. If you want to do dream work, childhood trauma, or attachment work, I'm happy to do that as well. Other than that, thank you so much for tuning in. If you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing, it would really help to get this video into YouTube's algorithm and also help to get others into some shadow work as well. I think our world needs it. Other than that, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one. All right, take care.